Miss Nathalie Munyampenda from Kigali, from Rwanda. It's a great pleasure, Nathalie, to receive you in this webinar and to discuss about some issue concerning our African continent in this situation of pandemic of COVID-19 that we suffer a lot about that. And we see that there is some good experience in Africa. We arrive until now to resist to this pandemic situation, to this terrific situation. We see that there are a lot of travel around the world. There is a lot of changement around the world. And we want to discuss with you, to have your opinion about that, and to see how African continent can perceive this pandemic and can manage it, not now, but we hope to see how we can manage this question, this issue in the post area, in post COVID-19. First of all, just to present the Policy Center for the New South. The Policy Center for the New South is a think tank installed in Morocco, in Rabat, focused on African issue, strategic and politics issue, and economic development issue. We are very open to work with African think tank and African institution, and also other institutions around the world. We have several partners around the world, been in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in America, most Latin and North America. We publish a lot of paper, policy paper, books, brief, other things. Looks like more than 100 publications by year until now, and we hope to develop our works with other partners, mainly in Africa principally. Miss Nathalie Munyampenda, she is manager director of the next Einstein Forum and initiative of the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences. The next Einstein Forum is a building multidisciplinary community of scientists and delivering their expertise to empower government, business, and the public with scientific foresight. Nathalie is also the editor-in-chief of the Scientific African magazine. Prior to the next Einstein Forum, Nathalie worked for the Rwanda government, helping to build in the central government strategic communication unit. She has always worked for the Canadian government. And that's why I have a question that I didn't discuss with you before that, about something linking to the scientific sense, mathematics, about data. I will ask you about that after at the end. Well, just a first question, a general question. What about the situation in Africa now? Because lots of institutions talk about a catastrophic situation, talk about great danger, and the African country cannot support this pandemic because not have enough hospital, enough tools, enough doctors, enough strategy. Majority of country have very bad governance. What can you see about that? What is the situation in Africa against this COVID-19?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. We're very happy to take part in this discussion. Just to answer your question very quickly, what we are seeing as what people are saying that there's great danger coming to Africa, and that we're going to see, I think the UN Economic Commission for Africa had predicted something like 300 deaths in the most positive scenario. We have not seen that in reality. So if we were to look at the numbers globally, we have about 5 million infections around the world. About 1.6 of those in the US. Africa to this week, I believe, passed the 100,000 threshold only. So if you can think about it as a 1 billion, over 1 billion people in Africa, we only have an infection rate of 100,000, infection number of 100,000. 80% of those being asymptomatic, so that means without symptoms, visible symptoms. Death-wise, I think we're in the 3,000. I just want to check to make sure that the numbers are correct here. So that's quite low compared to what is being predicted. And the only reason for that, there's ongoing discussions about genomic reasons, maybe youth, maybe high levels of humidity. But we've seen around the world that in places with similar humidity, we have more deaths. With cases where there's the same age numbers, more deaths, more infections. And so the only, I would say, scientific reason for that, that we have yet to measure, is that African countries took the lead very early and shut down or instituted very severe measures to be able to not put pressure on their health system. So we have a weakness that our health system is quite poor. We don't have enough hospital beds. We don't have enough ICU beds. We don't have enough ventilators. And so we could not have a scenario. At the moment, we have about 5% severe or critical cases on the continent. We could not, the continent and the countries of the continent could not afford to have a worst case scenario, not even a medium case scenario. And so most African governments, despite our challenges in governance, despite our challenges, instituted a full lockdown, closing their borders, even closing travel between districts and cities. They made it by a full lockdown. That means you can't even leave your house besides for grocery shopping or for medical attention. This allowed a slowdown, especially in cases in countries where you have a lot of urban slums and social distance is impossible. And so by shutting down and restricting movement to slow down contamination, we've been able to really drastically drop the number of infection and keep the infection rate steady.
In the same way, because I think that we learned a lot of lessons from around the world. There is a lot of experience around the world, and we see how, for example, EU suffer a lot inside the institution and inside their country. And we see that even though it's a very development space, we talk about good governance anyway in Europe, but I think that they must, what does it mean? It's to recover their politics and rethink their budget about that. Can we talk about learning lesson from African countries? Because we see that there is a good experience, even though in North Africa, for example, in Morocco, in West Africa, in Senegal, in Eastern and Central Africa, Rwanda, for example. Yeah, we suffer, for example, South Africa, in Egypt, there is a lot of problem, but can we talk about an African lesson and can we talk about that the South give a lesson, can give new projects this anti-pandemic?
Yeah, we have a lot of lessons to give. And I think often because we are not spending a lot of time publishing briefs and going to media, it can be lost. But one of the things, several lessons. The first is that I was traveling around February when we were seeing the cases now coming to Africa. They had seen a lot of cases already in China, and it was moving to Europe, and we were getting those cases from Europe, actually, not from China. So the first thing that happened when I was traveling between Rwanda and Kenya, we were already being checked at the airport. We were already having our temperatures checked. We were already being asked for information for tracking. So we have some muscle memory with Ebola and dengue. And so we have some memory and the protocols already in place in terms of a public health response in a crisis situation. And that's one thing. They set up protocols from in February already. I was being asked, where am I going? Have you been in contact with anyone coming from China, etc. So they were already tracking us. They were tracking me in Kenya. They were tracking me here in Rwanda. When I was returning, I was having to fill out some information. What we did not see in Europe and in the US, no one was being tracked. So people were coming from China. People were coming from different parts of Europe. No one was tracking them. No one was asking them any questions. And they were infecting people on the plane, infecting people in the airport, infecting people everywhere. So that's the first lesson, putting up protocols very early. The second is that the shutdown happened very quickly. So you were talking about the situation in Morocco. The first case, I think, appeared in Rwanda on the 14th. And by 3 or 4 days later, they had already shut down the borders. So that's rapid response is something that can be learned from Africa, making quick decisions. And I think oftentimes in Europe and in places with, in Western countries, there's a lot of public discourse because these responses are politically heavy. So you're looking at coming elections, you're looking at how will this affect my political stance or popularity, you know, is this to the left, is this to the right of political governance, what will they say about us, what will the effect of the economy be? And so decisions take a very long time before they're made, whereas in Africa, the decision making was very quick. And then they were discussing how do we then alleviate the kind of suffering people will go through because they can't work. So economic stimulus. So there was very rapid and quite united voice coming from Africa around debt forgiveness, around economic stimulus that is needed, and around decision making. And even now, to give you an example, in the region, the East African region, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, we're having some trouble because the truck drivers that are moving goods, because obviously there's no people flying between countries at this point, but there are goods that are being moved around. And we're having some uptick of cases through truck drivers, especially those coming from Tanzania. And so countries have been quite proactive in trying to manage that, to make sure that numbers keep low and that business continues to flow. So Africa has been quite innovative, even on the technology side. So the rapid diagnosis test that we have in Senegal, that's going to cost $10 at the end of it once it's shipped out. So we've been innovative because there's so, I mean, in Europe, we have also a big issue of regulation, so much regulation. So if you're going to put out a test, a diagnostic test, so much regulation. And I think because we just do not have the capacity health-wise, there's been a lot of push to move things as quickly as possible that could help the situation.
Yeah, the same way, because now we see that the world will change. It should that we will have post-COVID-19 very, very different than we live now and we live yesterday. How can African continent and African country generally manage their relation, their future relation, and perceive their relation with their partners in Europe, in Occidental world, and also with Asian, because we see that Asia return in force now. And I think that in this rivalry between East and West, principally between the United States and China, I think that the Asian are trying to win the battle until now. I don't know what it will be the solution and the result, but how can African country manage and perceive their relation and to make more balance in that relation and not to be only in one hand? Because first of all, we were in the hand of the Occident, totally controlled by the Occident, totally controlled by last colonial forces, and how to not be in the same situation with some Asian forces now and to be more independent in a reality.
I mean, I think the advantage, if you allow me to make that joke, the advantage of this current situation, or at least even the political, I would call it instability or turmoil that the West and Europe and even Asia countries are facing, means that Africa has to look inwards and decide what we are, what are the governance models, what are the governance models that we will aspire to. It's allowed us to do some internal thinking. And I think what's very important at this point is for us to be able to speak at one voice. I think it's critical that we roll out the free trade agreement, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, even though it's been pushed until January. We have to come together as one voice and make decisions. What has been happening in the past is that when we decide on something important on the continent, we agree when we get the time to vote or the time to do something. You know, France will talk to some people, the US will talk to some other people, and then we all vote differently. And so this is the time really, it's kind of a situation of a life and death situation for us to vote as one block and to decide what it is. To give you an innovation framework on the continent. And one of the things that is happening is that we are just, you know, we're not regulating even the idea of privacy and data protection. We have lots of different countries have different laws, but we're not implementing anything. So there is a need for us to move away from more conversations, more conferences, and to agree and then to negotiate exceptions. So, and that's an implementation issue. The second thing, I actually think it's been very good for us that President Trump has avoided us. I think it's good for us to stand on our feet. We have the resources, we have young people, and the future is ours. And so if we don't do it, we will continue to increase in the level of unemployment. And I think for me, I'm at a point where I think that the countries that are moving forward should move forward, and then the other countries will follow. And for us to be bold. Europe is hung over regulation. And so you have to get everyone to agree before you move forward. We cannot work in that type of space. We have to look at, and then another very important thing is a lot of industries, I was looking at the numbers in terms of digital payments. In Rwanda, for example, from January to April, we've seen a 450% jump in payments via mobile phone. And so we have to contextualize our solutions and say, we are not going to grow e-commerce, for example, on a PayPal or on the normal e-commerce platforms. We have to create our platforms based on our context. We have to fund them. So there must be mechanisms like Europe has, early research funding. And then we must look to the East in Asia, because they fund the commercialization of solutions very much better than we see in Europe, for example. So we have to find a hybrid African solution and agree and fund it. That's part of the problem we need to address quickly. I think the future is bright. We have to figure out education, technology, how we add technology. We have to talk about citizen rights and data protection and have that at the beginning of the conversation, not at the end. We have to talk about, what's going to happen in this new world, because for us, it's come faster. I always talk about the future of work. The future of work is now. So if we live in not just the pandemic, we have the climate crisis that's next. At the moment, we have locusts coming down East Africa, eating the equivalent of the whole of East African population every day, twice. So we are going to be in a constant crisis mode. And so we have to really decide, countries have to decide within this free trade agreement, which sectors will we excel at? What is our competitive advantage? What can we fund? And making sure that it aligns, because the market is Africa. I think for the past, the market has always been outside of Africa. So today, the market is in Africa. And so to get a competitive market, we have to do certain things.
And must be also controlled by African themselves. And when I remember the forum organized around the world with African, all the time we see India with Africa. There is only one India, but we have 45 countries in Africa. There is no one bloc. Same thing with Japan, with China, with Europe. I think that African, they must go to this forum to the negotiation, one bloc, not several countries and several interests and several contradiction. In the same way, we see, and this is a local experience here in Morocco, that we see that there is main four area, very strategic, begin to be more interested. First thing, the internal communication, how to communicate with your people, with citizens, to tell them the reality, to tell them the truth, not lying them. And it gives us a very, very good thing. Second thing, local industry. Even though it is small industry of transformation or something, like, for example, building some mask test, respiratory, this is something very important. Third thing, the food security, because all borders now are closed, and there is some country who suffered a lot. For example, in the Middle East, for example, the Gulf country, they import all their alimentary goods. And four things, the instruction, academic, education, and also using new technology to win that. And this is forming, how can African do that? How can African manage those four areas to have a better and the best future?
So one of the things is on the continent, if you look at, I'll use the example of Canada, they were doing cash transfers. And so no country in Africa can do this successfully. We just don't have the money to do cash transfers to each person. And even the logistics around how you get this money in Kibera, for example, which is a Kenyan slum. So we have to be quite creative in how we respond to basically in the social protection net of our people. But let's look at those four things you discussed. The first, let me start with education. So what we're noticing is that we were not ready. So we were gradually getting there, and what we were having is some courses online, some resources online, but to do education online requires access. So you have many kids who don't even have access to the computer or laptop or a tablet. You have to talk about broadband. So what you do in rural areas where there's no broadband. And then, so those issues, the access to infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and then to talk about the content and how that facilitates learning. Because what we're having, and this comes back to the idea of the future of work or the future of skills, what we've been having is that we put all the content online, and then those who can't put it online, they have it on radio and it just plays. And we assume that because we've put it there, the kids are learning. They're not learning. Okay, and so in this new world, how do we, where we're seeing moving to online, how do we empower education technology companies and ministries of education to make sure that children are actually learning? So they have access, but when they also have access, they're learning that allows them to have skills that they grow into new careers. So that I think is a thing we need to address very quickly. What we've seen, for example, in Kenya is that the telecommunications companies have joined some of the successful education technology companies, and they've gotten support from the government to allow children to access for free using the telcos, different telcos, but also to do assessments, to find out, to do kind of a pilot. How are kids learning? What questions they're asking? And one of the companies is allowing children to ask questions. So we really have to quickly assess that and do better. Quickly, in terms of food security, this is a very critical factor. The countries that were more food secure have had less issues than the countries that are not food secure. So food security is food security that doesn't put in danger our climate commitments, because we're seeing, for example, here in Rwanda, major landslides. So we have to, even if we're increasing the production of food, because we want to make sure that when borders close, we're not stuck, we have to make sure that we are not in the future, basically consuming ourselves out again into another crisis. And the climate crisis will hit us simultaneously. So this is not going to be a pandemic that we can close our borders to. Third point, I think, local industry, very important. Giving the example of Taiwan, which is one, for me, the overall example of a country that basically ticked all the boxes in response. One of the things they were able to quickly do is to basically repurpose, to put money and a clear process for solutions in all categories, in protective equipment, in ventilators, in solutions for education and finance, everything. They were able to put funding, bring partners together, put up a regulation commission that was able to assess these very quickly and then scale these solutions. So we need to have that type of process in our countries, or at least at a regional level. And then finally, I think, and to have the public hear it all the time. So New Zealand was a very good example. The Prime Minister from the very beginning was very open. The countries that have been very successful in eliminating or reducing contamination were very clear. So for example, in South Korea and Taiwan, they were asking people for their mobility data. So every time, this is also in Wuhan, everywhere you went, you clicked in and they knew where you were. But in exchange for giving up your personal information, the government was giving you information saying this area is contaminated, don't pass here. This is what we're doing, give your opinion. So this is a time where governance, we can fix food security, we can fix education, but if we don't fix governance on the continent and what the public is owed, we're never going to be able to respond to this pandemic and future shocks like the climate crisis. Actually, the climate crisis is already here, but we won't be able to deal with the crisis.
Yeah, sure. You talk about data. We see that, and we make the experience here in Morocco of how to manage the situation and to manage the crisis. We suffer a lot about the data and how to organize the data, how to have access to the data. Even though for think tanks, for academics, there is a big problem, and now we see that the data are also about Africa are also produced in foreigner, produced by foreigner institution. I think that there is a big effort that Africa must make in that way. Between government, institution, continental institution, and local institution to produce our own data, to study our own data, and to base our politics and our policy and our strategy on this. I think that is the main major issue and challenge for African country. And by the way, I have a last question. What about a common framework in Africa, a common strategy against this and other challenge in Africa? Until now, we didn't see much EU acting inside Africa. I think that this is a big question. Not only EU, regional institution also. Even though there is some small activity, but there is no common and unique African voice until now. Even though we have some proposal by the north, by the south, by the east, but no common. How we can do that?
Yeah, so I think I always say that the African Union is only as empowered as we make it. So if we take some responsibility, citizens and organizations and countries, to make the AU more agile, which the process has started to reform it, and trying to be very clear about what are the responsibilities of regional economic blocs, what are the responsibilities of the AU, that will help. But coming back to the question in terms of avoiding cyber colonization, because our data data are held on foreign servers. So we have to, the way that we look at it at the next Einstein Forum is several ways. One, what is the infrastructure that is needed? And we need to fund that infrastructure. Number two, what are the regulations and what are the frameworks we need to put on? And we've been trying to secure funding to be able to study that, the current data protection implementation, to review that so that we can provide more implementable recommendations. But again, at the end, even with wonderful recommendations, countries have to implement these recommendations for it to work. Third thing is we actually don't have enough data scientists to be able to do what we're trying to do. So we even in the countries like Morocco, in Egypt, in Kenya, in Rwanda, in Senegal, we're producing data scientists. The African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, where I work, is producing these data scientists. The problem is there is not enough connection between education research and the national needs. So if universities knew that if we're producing this many data scientists, they're given some internships or fellowships to be able to study, they can help governments sort out data and come up with solutions that would help us use this data, because policymakers, what will they do with tons of data? They don't know what to do with this. So even if we collect, I was using the example here in Rwanda, they're trying to set up a mechanism where if you go to a restaurant, you have to give them your data in a way that's anonymized. And then they at the Rwanda Biomedical Center, they have tons of data. So then what do they do with this data? Who sorts through this data? So we need solutions that are created by African data scientists that allow us to review this and are contextualized. So we're building a platform like this, and we hope to have some results in the next few weeks, initial results, where you put in contextualized responses. So what we've done in Rwanda is not the same as what happened in Morocco. And number one, they should not be compared just like that. But if they're going to be compared, it's to allow us to understand in a population of this size, with density like this, if I do what Morocco did, will it work for me? Will it bring down contamination? When will the spike happen? Can we eliminate if we continue this way? What are the economic repercussions? So those are things that governments should be working with academic and research institutions to design research questions like that, to be able to deliver that. And not just at the national level, but at a continental level. We need to get out of, I'm really tired, honestly, I'm tired of going to conferences and webinars. I think it's time for us to do something. And it doesn't require a lot. We need to put up, a couple of $100,000, pilot something, test things, and see how we can roll it out. And we need to stop getting funding only from the European Union and other Western companies, because if they're running it, that some of that data is going to them with reason, because they're funding it. So if we want to take control of our data, we need to fund research, we need to fund servers and infrastructure, so that the data comes here, and we need to use it. We need to use the data that's being done to improve policy.
Well, That's very, very interesting. And perhaps we hope that we can work together between our two institutions and other African institutions to do that. And because I think this is a big, very big challenge and very big interest, not only for us, but for our government and for our people. Thank you very much, Nathalie. It will be a very great pleasure to hear about you, to learn about you, and to listen to you. And hope that we can continue to collaborate and to produce more for our African country for a better way. And hope that our African continent can support this pandemic and can learn about it and for a positive day, for a positive future. Thank you very much, Nathalie, to accept that and to make this interview with us. Thank you very much.
We'll keep working together. Thank you.
Thank you.